Marine Corps Junior, ROTC. Sergeant Major Clark here with our Economic Systems of Government class. This class ties directly into our Citizenship and Patriotism series of instructions. Now, there are a lot of things going on in the world as I record this in January of 2021. Even more so, there are a lot of shifts left and right, up and down, and swirling in the middle in the United States as it relates to our economic and political types of structure. This period of instruction is not designed for me to stand on a soapbox and preach capitalism from the top of a mountain. But what it will do is provide you a better understanding of how in countries who maintain in the past a socialist or communist economic system of government have always had those systems of government collapse. In this period of instruction, we're going to develop an understanding of what capitalism is, and we're going to compare it to socialism and communism. The lesson objectives for this period of instruction aren't just for testing purposes. They're for you to be a well-informed voting citizen. You need to explain the terms related to capitalism, communism, and socialism. You're going to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the differences between the three and understand the background and how all three of these evolved over the past few centuries. Before we get into the specifics of economic systems of government, we've got to understand keywords and definitions. The first one is mercantilism. This was the most successful economic practice between 16 and 1800 in Western Europe. And what it means is the economics of this process are where governments would use their economies to augment the state power, but it always came at the expense of other countries. A government would try to ensure that their exports, meaning the things that they were shipping out, the goods that they were selling to other countries, always exceeded their imports, meaning the things that they were buying from other countries. And they would accumulate their wealth through the form of bullion, aka minerals, aka gold and silver. They would determine how much wealth they had based on how much gold and silver they had and how they acquired it, through discovery, meaning mining, or through trades and exports of a nation. This was and is going to be very important when we talk about how this ties into our other government classes, our freedom documents and things like that. When we were declaring our independence, this process was one of the biggest reasons, not the only, but one of the biggest reasons why we broke from England and became the United States and had the American Revolution. The natural resources, the goods and exports that were available to Great Britain by way of the colonies was phenomenal compared to England, which was a very small island nation. Tobacco and things like that we'll talk about later. We were, if you remember, talking about taxation when we were in our previous government classes and how England had a monopoly on the colonies' economy. We were having all of the things that we were mining, growing, and exporting were being shipped directly to Great Britain because that was the law at the time. We were being taxed on that as colonists. Then that would take, those taxes would go into the pockets of Great Britain. Then Great Britain would take those same products, export them to other European countries, and then make even more money on that. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into the economic systems of government. Your next key word is entrepreneur, which is an individual who organizes, operates, owns, and here's the key word, assumes the risk in all business activities. All right. Another way to rephrase this is like business or small business owners. Your next key word is communism. It is supposed to be a classless society where everyone is supposed to be treated equally. When we talk about classes, we're talking about upper, middle, and lower class, financial classes, how much a person makes. Most folks in a capitalist economy are in the what we refer to as the middle class. Communism is supposed to be a socio-economic order structured upon the common ownership of the means of production, meaning the common ownership of the citizens and the government. When we talk about means of production, we're talking about the manufacturers we're talking about farmers, we're talking about business owners, and it's the absence of social classes, money within and around the state. Socialism means all or most resources of production are controlled solely by the government. Most goods and services are administered by the government and not by the private sector. If you ask political scientists what they thought the most important document in 1776 was, they'd probably say Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. But if you ask an economist that same question, he's probably going to answer Adam Smith's book called The Wealth of Nations. It was this book that outlined the theory of capitalism that became the basis for economic systems across many, many countries, not just the United States. In this lesson, we're going to explore the development of capitalism and compare it to socialism and communism. If you're familiar with our Marine Corps history class, we do our best to try to tie it into U.S. history. Around the time of our birth as a nation, there was a thing called the Navigation Acts, which were a series of laws passed by British Parliament that imposed restrictions on colonial trade. We were doing well financially. We had a lot of natural resources, as we'll talk about. These Navigation Acts, meaning the ships sailing back and forth in and out of our colonies to other countries, were restricted by the British economic policy that was based on mercantilism, which aimed to use our American colonies to bolster the British state of power and finances. It was these Navigation Acts that inflamed the hostilities of American colonists and proved to be a significant contributing factor to lead to our revolution. So what was this mercantilism thing? It was a primary reason, like I said, that we fought the American Revolution. The colonies were very important to the British economic success because they were an island nation. They couldn't afford to lose, this segment, meaning the colonies, of their economy. The colonies were very profitable in export and imports and a trade balance to Great Britain. Cotton was a fairly traded item. Tobacco was pretty new. And then we had a lot of natural resources. You got to remember that prior to this time, the majority of European countries were ruled by an absolute monarch, meaning a king or a queen. So let's talk about how this capitalism type economy developed. You should have already done your pre-work, which was watch the Capitalism Part 1 video in your learning platform. If you haven't already done so, pause this video, watch your Capitalism Part 1. It's only about 2.5 minutes or so, and then come back to this presentation. I hope we remember from our other government classes the continuing discussion of the Age of Enlightenment. This was a time frame where philosophers, economists, and government officials were getting together and determining whether or not this old school monarch type environment was good for the future of their individual nations. And they were spreading information from one to another. During that time, there was a book called The Wealth of Nations. It was a book that outlined the new kind of economy that we now know as capitalism. As I mentioned in my opening statements, it was written by Adam Smith and published in 1776. He was a Scottish economist and a philosopher during the Age of Enlightenment. And it was this new type of economic view that influenced all the major powers at the time, setting terms for economic debate and all kinds of discussion for the next century and a half. This book, called The Wealth of Nations, influenced all of the three main types of economic systems of government that are in existence today, including Karl Marx's socialist mindset, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison's capitalist mindset, as well as Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin's communist mindset. Under this new capitalist type system of government, the government practices a policy called laissez-faire. It literally translates to let do economics or leave us alone economics. It's referred to as a free market type of capitalism, meaning the government should remain out of the economy and instead allow the individuals to freely carry out their own economic affairs. In a pure capitalist society, the government does not interfere in the economic system. As long as the people respected the personal property and rights of others, they should be allowed to make decisions themselves. Under a pure capitalist type economy, entrepreneurs became very, very important. Now, we just went over what an entrepreneur was in our key word. They're the ones who are the business owners. They're the ones who accept risk. They're the ones who are starting up a new business and using the collateral on their home and their car and probably their kids' college money that they've saved up in order to start a business. It takes money to make money. They're the ones that own the businesses that produce the goods for trade. They're the ones who employ the workers. They're the ones that make the investment financially into the machinery that produces those goods. And they're the ones who set the prices for the market. Some examples of modern entrepreneurs are Ray Kroc, the guy who bought McDonald's from the Mac brothers, right? And then turned it into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Steve Jobs is another example of a modern entrepreneur. Capitalists believed, and still do, that free trade without any laws or regulations that limit the competition in the marketplace. No government involvement is their mindset in a pure capitalist economy. In a capitalist society, the price of the goods is not determined by the government. The price is determined by the marketplace through the law of supply and demand, meaning goods are more expensive if they're limited, if there's not as many of them in the supply, and the demand for them is great. An example of this is when personal computers first came out and became popular in the late 80s and early 90s. They were ridiculously expensive because there were not that many of them. Nowadays, you can get the new laptop for the price of a cup of coffee because they're just so common. Prices are lower if the supply is great and the demand for them is lower. Supply and demand. Remember it. Another factor in the theory of capitalism is that it operates in cycles, meaning you're going to have an economic boom. That capitalist economy is doing well. Our goods and services are at an all-time high, and then something happens within the stock market or within that economic system that would probably drop us down into a recession or maybe even a depression, like the Great Depression, where there was a ridiculous amount of people within our economy that were homeless and shelterless. But what is great about this cycle is that it will always cycle back around, and you will always, in a capitalist environment, get out of a recession, get out of a depression. You will have a revival, and there will always be that economic boom again to pull us out of it. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. In a capitalist economy, our measurement of income and success, I should say, is based on the gross national product, GNP. You got to remember that. Gross national product. The GNP is the total value of goods and services that are produced in the entire economy. Everything that economy makes, that they export out, is called the GNP. So here's that cycle we're talking about. When the GNP goes up and down, you have some fluctuations. When it goes down, you have unemployment that rises. When we are not making as much stuff to be exported, then there's not enough jobs available for people to make the stuff. Numbers of businesses sometimes go up and become bankrupt. The economy will see a decline in prices, so they're trying to sell everything at lower prices just so they can sell it. When an economy has a downturn that lasts for an extended period of time, it's called a recession. Tying back into that cycle. In a capitalist theory, the recession ends when the cycle reverses itself, meaning there are low prices which increase demand. Increased demand lowers the supply level, how much stuff there is. Short supply calls for an increase in production, meaning we don't have enough of it. So now I need to hire more people to produce this stuff, which means employment goes up. It increases the production which requires more labor, creating new jobs. New jobs lower the unemployment rate. More people are working, which means they've got more money to spend. If I'm making money, I can go spend my money, which increases the sale of goods. And then the economy revives itself. In a modern capitalist society, the government can sometimes play an active role in stimulating or getting the economy going again as needed. One of the many examples of a government stimulus is the establishment of tariffs on imported goods, meaning the things that we're buying from other countries. A tariff is a tax. We'll talk about that in a second. This action is sometimes called protectionism because it protects our own industry within our country and its workers, and it provides them some benefit and some financial relief from the burden of competing with a foreign company. A tariff is an additional tax placed on certain products from imports, things that we're getting from other countries. However, the consumer, you and I, are sometimes faced with paying a higher price for that item in the marketplace. Although the industry, that car dealership, that manufacturer, or that television manufacturer is protected from foreign competition, the American buyer is sometimes faced with higher prices for products. Now, this doesn't always last a very long time. And to be honest, it does provide the opportunity for us to think more daily about buying locally and American than dealing with buying imports from other countries. And what it will also do is if that country is being taxed and we are able to strike an economic deal with another manufacturer from another country that is maybe our ally, maybe like not China, then it's that right there will bring more of those same type items into our country from imports, and it will force American productivity to go up because now we're not competing with a very low, cheap quality item from a country that we're having a bunch of tariffs on. Now I've got a third party, a third country over here to the side that we're allowing those items to come in. Now, as an American entrepreneur, I've got to step up my game and build and sell better products at lower prices. All of those positively affect your and my wallet. In your learning platform, you have all the videos available to you. You should have already, in your pre-work, watched all of your videos. If you have not, then pause this video, click over to your learning platform, and watch the second part of the capitalism video. We're going to pivot real quick and talk about the economic boom that our country saw in the 80s and early 90s as a result of supply-side economics, which was developed and implemented by then President Ronald Reagan. Everybody's got to have a cool catchphrase. In the 2000s, under President Barack Obama's administration, they developed and devised newer plans for medical care, and they coined the phrase Obamacare. Well, in the 80s, supply-side economics became prominent in the success of our country, and we saw a very big economic boom. As a result, they nicknamed it Reaganomics. It's also called trickle-down economics and also called voodoo economics, meaning you got to have some kind of secret decoder ring or a witch's broom riding around with a magic wand to figure it out. Not the case. Trickle-down economics is actually pretty simple to understand. If you are providing for big business and making sure that those industries are successful, then those industries will continue to hire people. People will continue to make money. They will continue to spend money, and it will be a continuous good perpetual loop. I don't think there's anything voodoo about it. It's pretty simple. Trickle it down to the lower man on the totem pole, you and I. It emphasizes the need to consistently improve efficiency as a way of increasing economic growth. If we get stagnant and we continue to just be mediocre in our businesses, then they're going to go under. Supply side economics promotes the idea that high taxes on corporations, businesses, if you will, and on high income capitalists, meaning I make a lot of money. I'm a capitalist. I'm the business owner. You're trying to tax me in two ways. A, you're taxing my business and you're taxing me because I have a higher income than everybody else. You're taxing me more. That's going to discourage business expansion. Why am I going to start up a new business if you're just going to take my income away from me by taxing me more? All I'm going to end up doing is barely making enough money to keep the business going by the skin of my teeth and to pay my employees without actually being able to pay myself. They argue that the people will be unwilling to take risks and to take investment chances if the government is just going to take my profits away from me through regulations and through taxes. An example are state regulations. Right now, you've got many billion-dollar corporations leaving the state of California and moving to Texas. Texas is welcoming them with open arms because there are not a lot of regulations. They, being Texas, is not going to tax the heck out of these companies like Microsoft. They're considering it. Tesla is another one that's moving to Texas. I'm going to be able to make enough money by moving my business there without having state and federal taxes levying on me. By not having those taxes taken away from me as the business owner, I'm going to be able to take that money, reinvest it into my company, build more businesses, hire more people, and provide more of an income to them. We talked a moment ago about economic stimuluses. In order to get the economy going again, government would put taxes on imports to our country. Well, supply siders want to see an increase in competition by removing barriers for free trade, meaning a free trade policy simply means goods and services that can be bought and sold between countries or international borders with little or no government tariffs, taxes, quotas, subsidies, etc. The concept of free trade is actually the opposite of trade protectionism, which we talked about in a previous slide. They would supply siders would repeal special tax breaks to certain industries in order to have a more uniform tax code across the board. It keeps everything fair in all industries. If individuals and corporations have more money to work with because they're not being taxed to death, then they're going to expand their businesses, and then that wealth will, quote unquote, trickle down to you and I, the average worker. If you got 3 minutes and 30 seconds to kill, you can look up supply side economics in a little bit more detail and in its controversy by selecting the link in your slide here. If you got a minute and 15 seconds to kill, then throw Voodoo Economics into your Google machine, and then you'll get an idea of how I picture you receiving this class. Now that we've got a general understanding of how our capitalist system of government works, let's move on to communism. If you haven't already done so as part of your pre-work, you're required to pause this video, watch the 2 minute and 30 second video on what is communism. The link is provided in your learning system. In 1848, a German philosopher called Karl Marx wrote a publication called the Communist Manifesto. He simply took socialism and put a twist on it. He was an economist, a historian, a socialist, a political theorist, a journalist, and a socialist revolutionary. By the mid-1800s, many countries had adopted a capitalist economy. They saw how well the colonies, now the United States, were doing under this newer capitalist type economy. Well, Karl Marx had a very different opinion. He believed that capitalists had to take advantage of their workers in order for that business owner to be successful. He believed that capitalists paid their workers lower wages and maintained dreadful working conditions just so that they could make a profit. He argued during that time that workers would join together like slaves overthrowing their masters in a revolution. That's what he believed. And in some cases, and in some countries, there were communist and socialist overthrows of governments. The Communist Manifesto also talks about Marxist communist society, where everyone would produce according to his or her ability level. We would all contribute equally based on what we were able to contribute. Everyone would have access to consumer goods according to their individual needs. He believed in a classless society. Remember from your key word, where everyone was treated equally. Sounds great in theory, but as we move on, we'll talk about how when you remove the incentive, then nobody is willing to do anything. Unfortunately, Marx also believed that the only way to achieve this level of perfection was through a violent revolution of the working class against those in authority. This German philosopher called Karl Marx also believed that there would be a communist revolution to take place in countries like France, England, and Germany that were very industrial. They were making all kinds of products and exporting them to other countries. And it did actually happen in Russia about 70 years after the Communist Manifesto was written. There was a communist revolution. Russia at the time was primarily an agriculture country, a farming type country that was run by a monarch. And instead of calling them a king or a queen, the monarch in Russia was called a czar. Here's where you start to see the collapse. You have Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism, all different versions of the same defunct mindset of communism. Vladimir Lenin was the one who initiated this communist revolution, and he served as the head of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1924. Fast forward to 1925 when Joseph Stalin took over. When Joseph Stalin took over, he initially served as kind of like the head of the table or a member of the round table, this collective leadership. He was just the first among equals. Hey, we're all the same here. We're all working towards the same goal. We're all going to contribute equally. But over time, he consolidated enough power and he became the country's de facto dictator by the 1930s. In this Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx argued, and he believed, I should say, that after this communist revolution in all these countries that it was supposed to happen, it only happened in Russia at that time anyway, that these countries were supposed to have been run by a dictatorship just long enough to, quote unquote, prepare the way for the ideal utopian, everybody's the same across the board, no matter how hard you work or how little you work, everything's the same utopian society that he envisioned under communism. In Russia, however, Russia eventually became the Union of Socialist Republics, USSR, but Stalin never gave up his dictatorship. A whole 70 years would go by before the USSR would crumble in 1989 while President Reagan's administration was winding down its time in office. Not only do you not have a utopian society under a communist economy, but you've got some real hardships. Number one, the government owns all the means of production, and there's little to no private ownership. Well, if I, as a citizen, don't have private ownership, then I've got no incentive to do anything. If I don't have any buy-in, if I don't have the will or the want, then there's no need. Everybody's going to do it for me. Well, if I have that everybody's going to do it for me mindset, then nobody's going to do it all. The problem is that there was a 5-year term in economic planning, and it was centralized by the government. Every 5 years, they'd recycle and restart. Not good for the economy. Rapid industrialization could not be maintained by the government. As the government's trying to build all these factories and grow farms and make them larger and more prosperous, well, the money's got to come from somewhere. And if I have no incentive to make money, then I can't be taxed on that money. If there's no taxes on that money, the government doesn't get their money. If the government doesn't have their money, there's no way they can continue to industrialize and build businesses. Since then, there's been a collapse of almost every single communist country. Some of the communist countries today are not quite as communist in their economy, if you will, as they used to be. On an economic level, everyday life was marked by food shortages and fear. These were the things that the Russians were going through on a daily basis under a communist economy. Like we mentioned earlier, Karl Marx's objections and arguments against capitalism was that his belief was employers and big businesses, in order to make more money, had to treat their employees like garbage and pay them little to no wages. That's what his view of capitalism was. The irony is, ironically, under this form of communism, the government employed various forms of slave labor. Then you start to bring in religion. The communist society was atheist, meaning there was no God in their beliefs. And under Stalin's dictatorship, literally tens of thousands of Christians and Jews were killed. If you're up on your history, you'll know that communist Russia was also an ally during World War II and helped defeat Nazi Germany. However, after World War II, much of Eastern Europe became communist countries, and communism also spread to places like China, North Korea, North Vietnam, and eventually to Cuba, which is just south of Florida. However, as the decades passed, it became very clear that economically, the communist form of socialism, with its strict controls of both the people and the economy, would not be successful. And many of these countries' economies have failed. Now that we've discussed the failures of communism, let's discuss the root of communism, called socialism, and its failures. If you have not already done so in your pre-work, pause this video and get into the learning management system and watch the 4-minute video on socialism. Unlike a capitalist economy, in a socialist economy, all or almost all of the sources of production in that country are the property of the government. Most of the goods and services are administered by the government and not by private owners. Whatever private production and distribution does exist is carefully regulated by the government rather than by the free market process like we talked about in previous slides. The continued argument about whether socialism works or not revolves around the fact that there are democratic and non-democratic forms of socialism. In Western Europe, socialist countries like Sweden tend to be more democratic rather than their third world country socialist counterparts that tend to be more totalitarian, meaning a political system where there's only one political party in which they control everything and don't allow opposition. I hope you remember your democratic and totalitarian definitions from your political systems of government class. I love this quote. I've heard it a billion times. If I had $1 for every time socialism worked, I'd have $0. Coincidentally, if it ever did work, I'd also have $0. Some people believe that the only reason this socialist subcategory of Sweden's economy works is because it's such a very, very small country. It holds a very, very small footprint, and their imports and exports are nowhere near that of a larger country like Russia or the United States. If we're not careful, the United States will continually slide down the hill towards becoming a welfare state. In a welfare state, which is a modern version of a socialist economy, the government focuses on providing services for its population, pretty much doing everything for them without the incentive for their citizens to do and give and work for themselves. Some of these services and benefits can include old age and disability pensions. Hey, that don't sound too bad. Unemployment benefits. That don't sound too bad. Aid to families with dependent children. Income supplements for the poor. Public housing. Health care. Food stamps. Public education. And child care. These all sound great until it gets to a point where no one in the working class is willing to work anymore, which means they're not paying taxes, the incentive is gone. Why am I continuing to work to get the same things that I am earning when everybody else is getting everything on this list for free? Well, if they're getting it for free, then I've lost my incentive to work. The money is not flowing. I'm not getting it, and I'm not spending it. So if everybody else is going to get it for free, why am I busting my butt? I want it for free too. And then eventually, the well runs dry. In the countries that focus on providing for the welfare of its people, which is a good thing, you want to make sure your citizens are taken care of. That's a good thing. But the problem is, when that's all you're focusing on, then taxes get to be very high on those that are working. And many in today's society will argue for or against socialism because some believe it rewards and encourages laziness, or it discourages initiative and entrepreneurship. Wealth distribution becomes unfair. Some people believe it is fair. I want what you have. You make way more money than I do, so you should be taxed more, and you should distribute your wealth to the others that are not as wealthy. Sounds great in writing. It doesn't work in practice. Some people argue for and against socialism because some people say government should or should not regulate industry and Medicare, etc., or government should or should not be limited, depending on which side of the argument you're on. The reality is socialism has and will continue to fail across the world. In the 20th and 21st century, some recent countries that have failed as a result of their socialist economy are Venezuela, France, Russia, and Cuba. Disability pensions, unemployment benefits, aid, income supplements to the poor, public housing, health care, food stamps, public education, child care. These are all great things to have, no matter what kind of economy you have. But I hope you understand how these types of things that are promised in this communist and socialist utopia type economy, they're promised, but they never come to fruition for more than 3 generations. And that's the cold hard fact. Any country on planet Earth that has ever shifted from a capitalist economy to either a communist or socialist economy has never lasted more than 3 generations. Some would argue that China is a thriving communist country, but if you look at the real true economy in China, they are not quite as communist as they used to be. Their government is communist, but if you look at their economy, they've got a very capitalistic economy running up and down on their eastern seaboard. There are pockets within that country that are designated by zone to be a capitalist economy in their major cities. Their government is communist, the way they rule is communist, but their economy in the majority of the eastern side of China is actually capitalist. All of the services and benefits that a country needs to provide for its citizens, like unemployment benefits, food stamps, education, child care, health care, public housing, those are provided better in a capitalist economy, because although a capitalist economy has its ups and downs, it's cyclical and continuous, unlike a socialist or communist economy where those things that are managed by the government will eventually run out. Are we as a capitalist economy better equipped in some time frames, some generations, some eras to take care of its citizens with those things than others? Absolutely. But again, it's continuous and it's cyclical, unlike a communist or a socialist country where it's just going to end up collapsing. But one thing that should be clear is that in today's world, no single economic system completely rules. In the United States, we have a capitalist type economy and a government. We provide subsidies to industries. We stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates and imposing tariffs. And we provide a number of welfare programs at state and national levels. In communist and socialist countries, they seem to be opening their doors to private ownership, free trade, and greater competition. I mentioned China on this very topic just a few moments ago. As each nation develops, it becomes more important for its leaders and its people to realize that differences in economic systems may exist, but the common goals for the people make it necessary for great international cooperation. I hope you've got a better understanding of the differences between capitalism, communism, and socialism. I hope you understand that mercantilism, which is a country's economic success determined on how much wealth it is acquired through discovery, trade, and exports of a nation, was a key factor in our breakaway from Europe. I want you to understand that an entrepreneur is an individual who organizes, operates, and here's that key word, assumes the risk in business activities. You need to understand that capitalism is the belief in free trade without any laws or regulations that limit competition in the marketplace. I want you to remember that a capitalist economy is measured by the gross national product. I want you to remember that the gross national product is the total value of goods and services produced by an economy. You need to understand that communism was a mindset of a classless society where everyone was supposed to be treated equally. It was the idea of a socio-economic order structured upon the common ownership of the means of production, quote unquote, and the absence of social classes. I want you to remember that the Communist Manifesto was developed by a guy named Karl Marx in 1848, and communism is an offshoot of socialism. Socialism is a system of a system of economy in which most sources of production, goods, and services are controlled by the government and not the private sector like a capitalist economy. The modern version of the socialist economy has often been called a welfare state. And if you are a young man or woman who is close to becoming voting age and you're of the mindset that you want, as a young adult, the government to give you everything without earning it, then that's okay. Go ahead and vote that way. But you're going to ruin it for your kids and you're going to ruin it for your grandkids, because in a socialist economy, there is no incentive for the individual to work or produce or to accept risk in order to give back to that economy. And when nobody's working, when I take a look around me and I see other people doing absolutely nothing and getting things for free, why would I want to do anything myself? I want to end this with a social experiment that happened in a community college some time ago. So I want you to listen to this story because we're talking about grades in this story, but you can 100% equate this to money. So there was this economics professor who made a statement to her class that she had never failed a single student before, but she had recently failed an entire class. That class had insisted to her, while she's talking about capitalism, communism, and socialism, that socialism could and would work, and that no one would be rich and no one would be poor because socialism is that great equalizer. So the professor's like, okay, cool, let's have an experiment. From now on, all grades are going to be averaged, and everyone in this class is going to get the same grade so that no one fails, but no one's going to get an A. Now, if you substitute money for A's, maybe you'll have a better understanding. After the first test, the grades were averaged and everybody got a B. Now, this was because the students who studied hard helped out everybody else. Those students who studied hard were upset, and the students who didn't study or who studied very little, they were pretty happy with a B. Now, as the second test rolled around, The students who studied very little had studied even less. Again, no incentive. And the ones who studied hard decided that they wanted a free ride too, so they studied very little. And the second test average was a D. Nobody was happy. Now, as this third test rolls around, the average was an F. As the test proceeded, the scores never got better. And what happened is there was a lot of bickering, a lot of infighting, a lot of blame, a lot of name calling, and it all resulted in everybody having hard feelings, and nobody was willing to study for the benefit of the entire group. To everybody's surprise, everybody failed. And then the teacher comes back at him. She's like, hey, I told you socialism would work if everybody did their part. But socialism ultimately failed because there was no reward. When the reward is great, the effort to succeed is great. But when government takes all of the reward away, why is anybody willing to try? I hope that makes sense to you. These are about 5 things I want you to listen to that are applicable in this experiment. Number 1, you cannot legislate the poor into prosperity by legislating the wealthy out of prosperity. Meaning, I can't pass laws to make the poor not poor by passing laws that make the wealthy not wealthy. What one person receives without working for, another person must work for that without receiving it. The government cannot give anybody anything that the government does not first take from someone else. You can't multiply wealth by divvying it up. When half the people get the idea that they don't have to work because the other half is going to take care of them, and when the other half gets the idea that it does no good to work because someone else is going to get what they work for, then that's the beginning of the end of a nation.